Will the vision in my head translate to paper? There's only one way to find out, and that is to just do it. I'm about to take a leap of faith here and cover the whole eye with black. If you want to know why I'm doing this, stay tuned where I explain it and come see how it turns out. So let's start at the beginning. I decided to start with sepia and really block in all of the shadows, and I worked hard to make sure they were pretty dark from the beginning. I took my time, and for each area I began with the shading already provided in the line art and expanded from there. Welcome back, and if you're new here, welcome. I'm Catherine, the artist behind Bigelow Fine Arts. Today I am working up this dragon eye from Worlds Within Worlds by Kirby Rosanes. I have wanted to do this one for a while now, ever since I saw some completed pages with this image. Many of the pages I saw either had a pupil added in over the buildings or colored as a peek into another world, which I do think is how this was drawn and meant to be interpreted. I decided I wanted to do something different, and that goes back to my intro and why I wanted to fill in the already colored buildings with black. I want this to look like a reflection in the eye and not just a look into another world. So stick around and see how I made this come together. I have the colors listed on screen as always, and I also have the whole palette listed in a community post as well as for free on Patreon and Ko-fi. I'll be posting at least one big full-page video first Monday of each month. I'll work on getting a smaller video up in between the big main video on the third Monday of the month. The best way to stay informed is to subscribe and hit the bell notification. So my weakness seems to be going too light, so I made a strong effort to put in the time to add many layers and build up the color to make it dark and rich. I carefully worked my way around each horn as well as adding in a shadow to the top of the eye. I shaded each horn, working with the shading given in the line art, and this did in fact take a while. So while the video is only 30 minutes long, this did in fact take me over 10 hours to complete. Please take that into account when considering colored pencil work. It is slow, even though it looks fast here. And now it is time to begin building color and shaping. I put down a light layer of burnt ochre over the whole skin area of the dragon. I really wanted to do a green color, but I chose to stay away from green because I felt the desert feel of the buildings made this a more desert-colored dragon. I decided to go with browns and rust colors for my initial layers and build from there. I come in with sanguine next, and if you watch closely, I am only adding it in where there are shadows and just a little beyond that to help with the blend. I am using light layers, enough to get color on the paper, not enough to make the color too dark nor crush the tooth of the paper. With Indian red, I repeat the same process. I add in the color in all the darkest areas, blending it out a little. I am focused on adding color to the valleys. I am thinking of cylinders as I color in each of the areas. The shadow at the base will be dark, while the section in the middle will be the high point of the cylinder and will be receiving the most amount of light, hence the lighter color. So far, all of the colors are muted reds or browns. I need to continue adding in more layers to cover the paper. I can keep adding in more layers of the same color, but I like to mix my colors, and so I come in with walnut brown and added in a light layer over all of the skin, as well as a few extra layers in the darker shadowed areas. I am feeling out the colors as I go, and at this point I was still thinking something desert colored. Honestly, the walnut brown layer can likely be skipped. It isn't a wrong color. I made one of those later. It is just another layer in a sea of layers. I decided I wanted to punch the color up a little more, so I came in with dark red and put down a layer working from the darkest parts of the shadows out towards the lighter part. I am not going all the way. I leave the center light still, but I do want to feather the color out towards the center so I can better blend with the highlight colors later. I add in more layers in the shadows to help get them darker and fewer layers as I get closer to the middle of the section. deep red. This basically is just going everywhere there is skin. I add in a light layer over the whole area, blending into the highlight, and I add in extra layers closer to the shadows to blend in better. I don't go all the way down into the darkest part of the shadows. I didn't feel it was necessary since the color is somewhat light. For the cheek down in the bottom right, I started having issues determining what shape to make it. And what I eventually ended up deciding was to have a highlight just under the larger horns and add in a shadow at the bottom horns. So the bottom right corner will be getting more shadow work, and I will be extending that to build up a cheekbone of sorts. Although I feel I have been doing well with keeping the contrast in shadows nice and deep, I decided to bring in black to deepen them a little more. I work up the deepest part of the shadows mostly, and I add in some to the eye. The eye has shading indicated in the line art on each side of the eye. I mostly restrict the shading to the sky portion, but I don't go out of my way to avoid the buildings either. This is several light layers, and I build up the color gradually. Right now, I don't need a lot of color. I will build up the whole page mostly in lockstep. Now that I have worked up the shadows, I move on to the highlights. They are really light since I have not been putting down as many layers. So I come in with burnt ochre and add in another layer over the lightest parts of the skin. The burnt ochre doesn't work as well with the reds I have been putting down, but it isn't a wrong color, just not the right color. I will be blending in more colors over top, more that aren't right and some that are. Every color adds to the overall color and enriches it. Here I made what I felt was a mistake in color choice. I decided it was time to start testing out a color for the horns. I began with walnut brown, a light layer over the whole horn. I added a touch of dark red to the shadowed side. I followed that up with burnt ochre to the lighter side, then some Indian red for more shadows, a blend with light flesh, and a touch of deep scarlet for the shadows again. And I moved back to working up more layers on the highlights while I sat and mulled over this color choice. I immediately didn't like it, but I wanted to give it a chance. I decided to add in a layer of light flesh, which I just found out is now called beige red. I add this to the highlights to add more layers and help them blend together. I am not thrilled with the light flesh. I don't know why I forgot that this has peach undertones to it. It isn't the greatest color here, and I feel like the polychromos are lacking in pale colors. And after I worked a layer of light flesh over the highlights, I decided the horn color just wasn't going to work. If it works for you, that's great, but I didn't like it. So here is how I removed most of the color. I began with a tacky eraser and lifted off what I could. Then I used a soft white eraser to rub out most of the rest. I went back over it with the tacky eraser again, and this time rubbing instead of just lifting. Not all of the color will be removed, but enough is removed that I can add more color on top and only have minor changes to the overall color. And now, since you know, it will be more visible in the final picture than had you not known. This is one reason why we are our own worst critics. We know all of the mistakes made and can still see them. This is my mistake, and I am sharing it with you, and it isn't even that big of a mistake. I tested a color and didn't like it, but maybe you liked that color. Back to the horn, and I add in sepia to add back the shadows that I removed when I erased everything. And I test out a new color on the next horn, starting with a light layer of bistre over the whole horn. I add in ivory on top for another layer. For the shadows, I add in black to make sure they are nice and dark. I then give the whole horn a blend with ivory and move back to the skin while I sit and mull over this new lighter horn color. The skin is still way too light in color. I need to add in more layers to really fill in the paper and to really bring up the color. I come in with Indian red and begin feathering more color out from the shadows. Right now the color looks washed out, and not all of that is due to the glare from my light. The highlights are really light and need a lot more layers without darkening up the color too much. I will need the highlight to remain lighter than the surrounding areas. So I am working in a way where I keep those highlights in mind as I add layers. I continue to think of cylinders. This whole page is mostly cylindrical shapes, and that is my basis for building my shadows. Back to the horns, and I decided to fill in the erased horn with the same colors. So a light layer of bistre, a layer of ivory, and darker shadows with black. Yes, it does look a little darker. It doesn't matter because most people will not notice it. I felt that this color palette for the horns worked, so I decided all of the larger horns will be done with the bistre, ivory, and black colors. To be more specific, the horns receive a light layer of bistre over the whole horn. I add in a little more pressure or more layers in areas I want to be a little darker. This isn't where there is already a shadow, but maybe an area beside a shadow where I want to extend the shading a little more. Thinking again in terms of cylinders, although this is a little more conical, I want the right side of the horn in shadow since that is where the line art is indicating shading. The line art only has shading in some places, where I placed sepia. So I used bistre to add in a couple more layers to the whole right side of the horn to smooth the shadows and darken them a little in the lighter areas. I came in with black next and worked up the darkest parts of the shadows, the areas where I didn't need to put extra layers of bistre since it wouldn't have shown up anyways. These shadows are at the base of the horn or in crevices or notches, the areas where the line art is heavier or indicating a shadow. And I blend with ivory. While everything else gets light layers, I am coming in with more pressure and blending in the bistre and black to speed up the layering process. This does make later layers a little harder to add over this area, so I want to make sure I have everything how I want it. I'm not burnishing, but I'm coming in heavy-handed, if that makes sense. So that is how I worked up the larger horns, but that leaves the smaller horns. I decided to make those a little darker, and no, not like that first failed horn. I come in with nougat over all of the little horns on the eyebrow. The nougat is acting like the bistre in this layer. I add in a layer of ivory over top. Some pressure, but not quite as much as the larger horns, because I know I have to come in with sepia for the shadows next, and I want to be able to easily blend from the shadows outwards with no harsh lines. I do find that the harder I press, the harder it is to get smooth coverage with additional layers. I liked how that turned out, so I decided to work up all the little horns on the cheek next. I worked up the nougat, then the sepia for the next color so I could get a smoother gradient before giving a blend with ivory. Again, going back to noticing how firmer pressure makes it harder to get smooth blending in later layers. And so the remaining horns are just the last of the large ones, and I come back with bistre, sepia because I had it fresh in my mind, and a blend with ivory to finish off the horns on the cheek. I repeat that for the top left horns to finish all of the horns. And yes, I have been putting off working on the eye. I wanted to get the skin filled in even more, as it still needs more layers, and finishing off the horns helps get them out of the way as well. For the skin below the eye, I add in red violet. I am still not that happy with the cheek, and I keep picking at it, trying to figure out the best way to better define it. I add in more color, starting at the shadows, but pushing into the highlight area even more to decrease the size of the highlight. Right now, that large white section of cheek is distracting and too large in my opinion. I want to slowly decrease the size until I feel better about it. I also add in more to the shadows on the rolls under the eyes. Again, I am thinking of cylinders here. I want that center part to be light. Not this light, but definitely lighter than the shadowed areas. For some of the shadows, I come in with black and I add in a layer right up against the line art to help fade it back into the picture. None of the lines in the shadows are really easy to see, but this will help them disappear even more. So right up against that line art in the shadows, I add in some black. Time to slowly knock back the brightness of the highlight. I add in a light layer of dark red over all of the skin areas. I work it lightly so I can slowly bring down the brightness. I don't want to add too much and not be able to see the highlight at all. Okay, finally, a little eye work. And I use bistre for the tree trunks and pine green for the tree fronds. Then I go back to working up the shadows a little more and blending into the highlight a little better. And I decided to give this lower section a blend with white. I thought it made for a nice blend, but it did leave a milky film over the color. Future me would skip this layer. It wasn't really needed, and the white film did stand out to me later on. Back to the eye, like I said, I'll be jumping around here. I begin filling in some of the roof patterns with purple violet. I'm not planning this out. I just randomly color in some sections over the various roofs. I do the same thing with dark chrome yellow, which I was hoping would show up more orange than it did. Then jumping back to the highlights, I blend the rest with white. Again, future me would just skip this. I would rather see little dots of paper show through than see a white milky film over the highlight. For some reason it wasn't noticeable as I was doing this. And jumping back to the eye, I add in more dark chrome yellow, filling in some of the sections I already did with another layer to catch a few of the corners I missed. Then deep scarlet red for that pop of red. I again pick random sections to fill in. I am limiting my colors mostly to the roofs for now. Another light layer of color over all of the highlights. I used dark red this time. I am also looking to offset the white milky layer with a little more color. I decided to add in shadows to the buildings in the eye, so I come in with sepia and work them up. I assume the light to be coming from the right based on a few clues in the line art, so I add in shadows accordingly to the left side of everything. And for windows and doors, I add in black to help make them look even darker. For the buildings themselves, I wanted something sand-colored. I was going to go with terracotta, but felt that might be too orange, so I went with raw umber, which I felt was a much better choice. So I filled in all of the main parts of the buildings. I wanted to keep the color to the roofs and leave the buildings quite plain. I did add in extra layers to places where I had placed sepia. I hit up a tree frond I missed, and then I add in dark cadmium orange to get that orange color I really wanted earlier. The yellow worked great as a yellow, but this is the better orange color for this area. I go back through with deep scarlet red, dark chrome yellow, and dark cadmium orange to fill in missing sections as well as make sure that filled sections don't have thin spots of color. Or missing spots, that sometimes happens. I blend the main parts of the building with ivory, and now comes the leap of faith. I come in with black and start covering everything up with a thin layer of black, leaving the center untouched, as well as an area for a highlight that will be evident in a little bit. I have seen several versions of this page where people fill in the city as if looking through a peephole, which is what I think the page really represents, or with a pupil covering it. But I wanted to show this as a reflection, and for that I needed to color in the eye as an eye. Many of the images of lizard eyes that I looked at appeared black, so I went with black. I do come in with Indanthrian blue to add some blue to the sky, but I add in more black, darkening the edges of the eye to make it look like an eye. I really work up the edges, bringing the color inward slowly until I think I have it where I want it. I come in and fill in some of the skin folds next to the eye. I use dark red, red violet, deep scarlet red, and sepia. Then more black because I felt it needed more. I fill in the highlight with white just to have something down on the paper. A touch of more Indanthian blue in the darker areas, then I blend in sky blue for the lighter areas of sky. I touch up a couple of spots on the buildings, then I go back to the cheek with more red violet and blend it and the other highlights with ivory. The highlights look really light, but that is the glare from the light. I need to work out a better position with less glare. The final photo shows the contrast much better. I hope this has given you ideas on how to work up your page. I had a lot of fun with this page. If you followed along, please let me know below or tag me on social media. If you found this helpful, please like and share so others can also find this video. If you're new here and liked what you saw, consider subscribing so you can be informed of when the next video is posted. I'll be working on something from Fragile World next, but if you want to see something else from Worlds Within Worlds, check out this playlist for a double-page spread of whales and lily pads. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy coloring!